You're about to learn something your history teacher never mentioned, and it's not what you think it is. Everyone talks about what frontiersmen carried to stay alive, but nobody talks about why they could carry it in the first place. The answer isn't in the weapon. It's in something so obvious, so embedded in the fabric of American life 100 years ago, that we've completely forgotten it existed. That's the real story. Your grandfather's generation lived in a world where a man's pocket was considered his own jurisdiction. There was no database tracking what he owned. There were no security cameras in the general store. There was no expectation that the government knew what he was carrying when he left his house. And that single absence, that invisible freedom, is what made every pocket a toolkit for survival. But here's where it gets interesting. The weapons your grandfather carried weren't designed to be weapons at all. Most of them were so perfectly disguised as ordinary items that the line between tool and defense blurred completely. And that's not an accident. That was intentional engineering. That was frontier ingenuity refined across generations. That was a man understanding his world and adapting to it with whatever lay closest at hand. The real secret wasn't the specific items, it was the mentality behind carrying them. A miner didn't carry a roll of quarters because he was planning violence. He carried it because he understood something we've lost entirely. Personal security was his responsibility. It wasn't delegated to authorities. It wasn't somebody else's job. It was his, and everything in his pockets reflected that understanding, that readiness, that preparedness, that assumption that the world could change in an instant. Now, before you think this is just a list of dangerous objects, understand this. Most of what we're about to cover was legal to carry for one simple reason. Nobody had yet decided to make it illegal. And the items that were illegal were only prohibited because something changed in American society that your grandfather would barely recognize. The government's relationship with citizens shifted, the assumption of personal responsibility faded, the right to ordinary self-defense became compartmentalized, regulated, restricted. We're not going to glorify violence, we're not going to pretend that carrying certain items makes anyone safer. What we are going to do is understand how your grandfather moved through the world with different assumptions, different constraints, and different freedoms than you have now. And once you see those differences, you'll understand why so many of the things he considered ordinary survival carry are now prosecutable offenses. The first category we need to understand is what we might call passive armoring. Objects that weren't designed for defense but became formidable in the hands of someone who knew how to use them. Your grandfather knew these instinctively. His father taught him. His grandfather taught his father. There was no formal instruction. There was no YouTube video. There was just the transmission of practical knowledge across generations. Take the simple work glove. A quality leather glove, thick enough to withstand the abrasion of rope or metal, became a completely different object when filled with sand or lead shot and sewn shut. It wasn't a weapon. It was a glove. But the moment violence became likely, that glove transformed into something considerably more serious. And here's the thing. Your grandfather could carry that glove openly because it was exactly what it appeared to be. There was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing questionable about it. It was just a glove a working man wore. The mountains of Appalachia during the early 20th century were filled with blacksmiths, not fancy armor smiths, just men with a furnace who could shape metal according to specific requests. And certain requests became tradition. A man might ask for a fistload of metal wrapped in leather. Another might want a specific weight distribution in a shortened club. Another might ask for brass knuckles configured a particular way. The blacksmith didn't ask questions. He was providing tools. What those tools were used for was the customer's business. But the real genius, the part that made this whole system work, was that these items were impossible to distinguish from their legitimate uses. A weighted glove was just a working man's glove. A length of chain with wooden handles was a tool for moving logs. A modified leather strap was just an old belt. Your grandfather understood that the best defense against accusation was an object that had a perfectly legitimate explanation. This is where we get to something crucial that most people miss entirely when they talk about frontier weapons. The legality of an object depends entirely on how it's perceived and classified. A knife is a tool until someone decides it's a weapon. A club is firewood until someone decides it's a bludgeon. A chain is equipment until someone decides it's an implement of violence. Your grandfather lived in an era where this ambiguity worked in his favor. The moment something was manufactured specifically as a weapon, it could be prohibited. But as long as it had a legitimate, primary purpose, it remained legal. The authorities in mining towns faced an impossible problem. How do you prohibit a coal miner from carrying tools related to his trade? How do you tell a farmer he can't carry the implements of his livelihood? You can't. So the system that evolved was based on interpretation and context. A man could carry almost anything as long as nobody could prove his primary intent was violence. And that distinction, that hairline of plausible deniability, is what made so many of these items available to your grandfather. The company towns that dominated coal country in the 1920s and 1930s created their own legal systems. The mine operators employed their own security. The company store operated as both retail and administrative center. The company owned the housing. The company ran the courts. And within this system, certain items were overlooked because they were useful to the company as well. A miner who could defend himself was a miner who might deter theft, protect company property, or handle problems without involving formal authorities. So there was a strange equilibrium. The company didn't want weapons that could be used against them, but they understood that basic self-defense capabilities kept their workforce stable. This is the context nobody mentions when they talk about what your grandfather carried. He didn't carry these items in a vacuum. He carried them within a specific social and legal framework that has completely changed. He operated under assumptions about personal responsibility, about property rights, about the relationship between the individual and authority that are nearly incomprehensible from a modern perspective. The second category of items your grandfather carried falls into something we might call adaptive tools. These are objects that had a primary, legitimate function, but could be adapted for defense. And the adaptation required specific knowledge. You couldn't figure it out by accident. You had to be taught. You had to understand the physics. You had to understand how to carry it. You had to understand the legal implications of possessing it a certain way. Consider something as simple as a rope. A coil of rope was essential equipment for any frontier man. A miner used rope, a farmer used rope, a logger used rope, a man working on a railroad used rope. But rope could be fashioned into something considerably more serious. A loop tied with specific knots became a garrote. Rope wrapped around wooden handles became a flail. Rope soaked and allowed to dry became rigid enough to swing with significant force. But you had to know these methods. They weren't obvious, they were passed down. Your grandfather's generation operated with an assumption that has become completely foreign to modern Americans, that knowledge itself was a form of power, and that this knowledge should be transmitted carefully, selectively, to people who would use it responsibly. A father didn't teach his son how to fashion a rope into a garrote because he was planning a crime. He taught him because a man should know what was possible, because knowledge was insurance, because understanding the capabilities of ordinary objects gave a man confidence in uncertain situations. The fence posts that marked property lines in Appalachian communities were often made from specific types of wood selected for hardness and durability. A section of that wood, properly cut, became an absolutely lethal object. But it wasn't a weapon, it was wood, firewood, building material. A fence post was just a fence post, unless someone knew better. Unless someone understood how to select, carry, and deploy such an object. And that knowledge was compartmentalized, restricted to circles that understood its implications. This brings us to something critical about the culture of your grandfather's era that we need to understand. There was a code, unstated but absolute. Knowledge of certain capabilities was shared within specific circles, family, trusted community members, work associates. But it wasn't advertised. It wasn't discussed openly. It certainly wasn't displayed or bragged about, because the moment you displayed it, the moment you talked about it, the moment you created evidence that you possessed this knowledge, you had made yourself a target for legal action. The transmission of this knowledge happened in specific contexts. A father might take his son to a remote location, a section of woods, a creek bed, and show him how certain objects could be adapted. Not written down, not formalized, just demonstrated, understood, and kept private. The moment that knowledge became public, the moment there was documentation, it became prosecutable. So the entire system depended on oral transmission, on discretion, on an understanding that certain knowledge was powerful precisely because it wasn't discussed. The authority structure in mining communities was also completely different from anything that exists in modern America. The company employed the security. The company functioned as law enforcement, but they were interested in protecting company property and maintaining control, not in enforcing laws the way modern police forces do. There was a different kind of accountability, a different kind of justice, and within that system, many items that would be classified as weapons now were simply understood as part of the landscape. The company also maintained a list of items they wanted to avoid, not because they were dangerous in general, but because they were dangerous to company interests specifically. A man with a gun represented a threat to company authority in a direct way. A man with explosives represented a threat to company property in a quantifiable way. But a man with what appeared to be ordinary tools, that represented something manageable. That represented a force that could be balanced against other forces. The leather sap is worth particular attention because it represents the perfect example of the category your grandfather carried. It was small enough to be completely concealable. It was heavy enough to be truly dangerous. It left marks that could be attributed to a fall or an accident, and it was impossible to prove intent without additional evidence. A man could claim he carried it for self-defense. He could claim he didn't know it was in his pocket. He could claim he used it to break up frozen ground or compact soil. The ambiguity worked entirely in his favor. But here's the detail that changed everything. The moment authorities decided that a leather sap was specifically designed as a weapon and for no other primary purpose, its legal status completely shifted. It couldn't be classified as a tool anymore. It couldn't claim legitimacy in any occupational context. It became purely what it was, a device for inflicting injury. And that's when the prosecutions began. That's when your grandfather's generation had to become more careful about what they carried openly. The transition from legal to illegal didn't happen in a single moment. It happened gradually, unevenly, across different jurisdictions and different time periods. Some states moved faster than others. Some communities resisted longer than others. But the general direction was inevitable. As the government consolidated power, as law enforcement professionalized, as a national legal system began to standardize what was permissible and what was prohibited, the ambiguity that had protected your grandfather's generation began to disappear. The prosecutions that began in the 1950s and 1960s weren't random. They followed a specific pattern. Communities that resisted government authority faced increased enforcement action. Individuals who were known to possess items that were becoming prohibited found themselves targeted. The message was clear: you can no longer carry these items. The age of plausible deniability is over. And this is where we arrive at the crucial distinction that most people miss entirely. Your grandfather wasn't carrying weapons because he was preparing for war or planning violence. He was carrying tools of self-defense because that responsibility fell entirely on him. There was no expectation that authorities would protect him. There was no assumption that he could call someone for help. He lived in a world where violence was possible and where preparation for that possibility was simply prudent. It was practical. It was normal. The items he carried were selected based on their utility, their concealability, their plausible legitimacy, and their legal status in that specific time and place. As that legal status began to change, as prohibition expanded, your grandfather faced a choice. He could adapt to the new legal reality. He could continue carrying items that were becoming illegal and accept the risk, or he could rely more heavily on the items that remained legal while understanding that his world was changing. Most men in his position chose the first option. They adapted. They put away the items that were becoming prohibited. They found new equilibriums within the new legal landscape. They didn't fight the transition. They simply adjusted to it, the way people always do when legal structures change around them. But they didn't forget what they had carried. They didn't forget why they had carried it. And they certainly didn't forget how to carry it, should the situation ever require it. That knowledge remains transmitted, even now, even in communities where most of what your grandfather understood as normal self-defense is now prohibited. But here's what most history books miss entirely. Your grandfather didn't just put these items away and forget them. He encoded that knowledge into his children. Not always directly. Not with instruction manuals or demonstrations, but through stories told around kitchen tables, through casual mentions of what worked and what didn't, through the simple act of watching him navigate the world with confidence despite carrying nothing obviously illegal. He taught his sons something far more dangerous than any weapon. He taught them the principle behind the weapon. And that principle was this: every object in the world has multiple purposes. A leather belt is clothing. A handful of gravel is nothing. A car key is a key. A wire loop is just metal. But in the hands of someone who understands the physics, the angles, the leverage points of human anatomy, these ordinary objects become something else entirely. By the 1960s and 1970s, the legal walls were closing in faster. What had been tolerated in the mountains became explicitly prohibited in state statute after state statute: brass knuckles, blackjacks, slingshots above a certain size, gravity knives. Even the possession of a spring-loaded object with the intent to use it as a weapon became a prosecutable offense in some jurisdictions. But your grandfather adapted in ways that lawyers never anticipated. He began carrying a roll of quarters instead of pennies. The weight was different, the distribution changed, the physics altered slightly, but the principle remained. He wore a belt buckle that was technically decorative, but happened to be made of stainless steel and weighed 14 ounces. He carried a folding knife that was perfectly legal because it opened slowly, required 2 hands, and technically didn't fall under any of the increasingly specific prohibitions written into law. He was learning something that would become the foundation of modern survival intelligence. The law doesn't prohibit harm. It prohibits categories of objects. It prohibits intentions made material. It prohibits devices specifically designed for violence, but it struggles to prohibit ordinary objects repurposed through knowledge and understanding. This is where the story diverges dramatically from what you'll read in academic accounts of frontier life or mining history. The textbooks treat weapons as static objects with fixed purposes. They catalogue what was carried, when it was carried, and when it became illegal. They create neat chronologies of prohibition and compliance. But they miss the actual mechanics of how knowledge persists. Your grandfather didn't need the brass knuckles to still understand how to harden his fists. He didn't need the sap to know how to weight his jacket pocket. He didn't need the corn knife hanging on the barn wall to understand the geometry of blade work. The prohibition of the object didn't erase the understanding of the principle. And this is exactly what alarmed legislators and law enforcement as the 20th century progressed. They realized, too late, that you cannot legislate away understanding. You can confiscate objects, you can prosecute possession, you can expand the definitions of illegal weapons to cover more and more territory, but you cannot unlearn the physics of impact. You cannot legally prohibit someone from understanding how gravity works, how leverage multiplies force, how the human body breaks. The focus, therefore, shifted. If the objects themselves couldn't be completely controlled, then the intent had to be policed more carefully. The location had to be restricted. The person had to be profiled based on where they came from, what family they belonged to, what skills they demonstrated. In Appalachia specifically, this created a strange tension. The law enforcement community knew, from lived experience, that men from mining families carried knowledge that made them dangerous, in ways that had nothing to do with visible weapons. A man who had spent 20 years swinging a pick underground understood body mechanics in a way most people never would. A man who had climbed rope and navigated confined spaces under extreme stress had developed an intuitive understanding of spatial geometry and leverage. These weren't attributes the law could address directly. You couldn't prosecute someone for being strong. You couldn't arrest a man for understanding how to use his body efficiently. But you could certainly stop and search him more often. You could question his movements. You could build a profile based on occupation, family history, and address. What emerged across the mountain regions was a kind of informal arms race between what remained legal and what remained prohibited. Your grandfather might have abandoned the blackjack, but he learnt that a bar of soap wrapped in a sock weighed almost exactly the same and was perfectly legal to possess because it was just soap and a sock. He might have given up the sap, but a D battery inside a rolled newspaper was technically not an illegal weapon because neither the battery nor the newspaper fell under any prohibited category. The roll of pennies became a roll of dimes. Then it became a roll of coins wrapped in duct tape, which added additional weight and distribution properties while still being composed entirely of legal items. The genius of this adaptation wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Your grandfather understood something that modern self-defense industry marketers still don't fully grasp. The most powerful self-defense tool is the one that nobody recognizes as a self-defense tool until the moment it needs to be. The most effective weapon is the one that leaves no evidence of intent before it's used. The most durable self-defense knowledge is the kind that cannot be prohibited because it's based on principles, not objects. By the 1980s, something interesting had happened in the mountain communities that your grandfather inhabited. The legal categories had become so specific and so numerous that they had actually become somewhat useless. Prohibitions on gravity knives became irrelevant when switchblades could be acquired. Rules against certain handle configurations meant nothing when dozens of handle shapes remained legal. Restrictions on weighted objects didn't matter because the number of ordinary weighted objects in any home was essentially unlimited. The law had created such a maze of specific prohibitions that it had accidentally created a maze of loopholes, and your grandfather had learned through decades of observation and careful legal study exactly how to navigate that maze. He wasn't breaking the law, he was simply understanding it more completely than it had been written. This knowledge, this ability to work within the legal framework while still maintaining a capacity for effective self-defense, became the actual inheritance, not the objects, not the weapons that had been confiscated or abandoned, but the understanding that legal systems are always incomplete, always contain gaps, and always can be navigated by someone patient enough to study them carefully. Your grandfather could sit across a table from you today and explain, in completely legal terms, exactly how to construct, carry, and deploy effective self-defense measures that would pass any legal scrutiny, but that would nonetheless be devastating if ever actually used. And he could do this because he had spent 40 years learning the difference between what the law said and what the law actually prohibited. The reason most people never understand this is because they approach self-defense from the wrong direction. They start with the question, what can I legally carry? And the law gives them a list of prohibited objects. They cross-reference against the prohibited list and conclude they can carry whatever isn't mentioned. But your grandfather approached it differently. He started with the question, what do I need to carry? And then he worked backward through the legal framework to find objects that served that purpose while remaining legal. It's the difference between thinking about constraints and thinking about solutions. This methodology was so effective that by the time your grandfather was in his 60s, he had essentially weaponized his understanding of everyday life. Every object in his world had a secondary purpose he understood implicitly. A walking stick was a walking stick, and also a pressure tool. A keychain was keys, and also a hand-hardening device. A coat was a coat, and also a protection layer for impact. Shoes were footwear, and also impact distribution systems. He had achieved a state of perpetual, legal, impossible to prohibit self-defense readiness. Not because he was carrying illegal weapons, not because he was breaking any laws, but because he had spent decades understanding the difference between an object and its application, between prohibition and capability, between what the law said and what was actually possible. And this knowledge, this fundamental reorientation of how to think about self-defense in a legal environment, was what he passed on to his children. Not as instruction, but as example, not as lessons, but as lived understanding. This knowledge was never written down. It was never formalized into a system or published in a book. It existed in the space between what a man did with his hands and what he understood about consequence. In the coal camps of eastern Kentucky, in the hollows of West Virginia, in the logging towns scattered across the Cumberland Mountains, this understanding moved from father to son like a handshake that never ended. The son would watch his father tie a knot and understand something beyond knot tying. He would see his father adjust his stance while walking and comprehend something about weight distribution that no manual could teach. He would observe the way his father positioned himself in a doorway or stood with his back to a wall and absorb an entire philosophy of spatial awareness. By the 1970s, a generation of mountain men had reached adulthood, having learned this language without ever being explicitly taught it. They could walk into any situation with nothing visible on their person and be fundamentally dangerous. Not because they were violent, not because they were looking for trouble, but because they had been trained their entire lives to see the world as a landscape of tools. This was the unspoken culture that emerged when you lived in a world where the law was often on the wrong side, where sheriffs answered to coal companies, where self-defense was something you had to accomplish without leaving evidence that could be used against you in a courtroom where the judge already knew what verdict he was supposed to deliver. The genius of this system was that it never crossed the line into illegality. A man could be arrested for carrying a blackjack, a man could be prosecuted for possessing brass knuckles, but a man could not be arrested for understanding physics. He could not be charged with a crime for having calloused hands and a certain way of moving his body through space. By the 1980s, federal law had begun to tighten. States passed increasingly specific legislation about what constituted a prohibited weapon. But the more the law tried to define and restrict, the more resourceful these mountain communities became. If you couldn't carry a weighted glove, you wore a heavier work glove. If you couldn't carry a sap, you put additional weight into your jacket pocket that had nothing to do with defense and everything to do with hand protection in cold weather. The most brilliant adaptation came in the mid-1980s when several people in Kentucky and West Virginia began experimenting with what would become known as documented tools. The concept was elegantly simple. Take an object that had a genuine, legitimate, everyday purpose. Document that purpose through photographs, receipts, or demonstration. Carry that object without any indication that it had secondary applications. A ball of twine was never a weapon. It was a tool for securing loads, bundling wood, fixing broken fences. But a ball of twine, tightened and densified over years of use, could be placed in a sock or wrapped in leather and become something with entirely different properties. The person carrying it had documentation, literally the manufacturer's label and a clear use case. This wasn't circumventing the law. This was understanding the law so thoroughly that you could exist within its bounds while maintaining capabilities that went far beyond what the law intended to allow. The federal government began targeting specific modifications and combinations, but by then, the philosophy was so embedded in mountain culture that it became almost impossible to enforce. Grandfather in Logan, West Virginia, could teach his grandson the proper way to wrap a handle without the grandson ever understanding that he was learning defensive technique. The wrapping could be for better grip on a work tool. The positioning of the wrap could be about comfort. The added weight distribution could be about control when using an axe or pick in difficult conditions. Every element had plausible legitimacy. Every element had documentation. Every element could be explained away in a courtroom or to a law enforcement officer. But the sum total of all these elements, combined with years of physical conditioning and spatial awareness training, created something the law could not quite define or prohibit. Interestingly, this knowledge also circulated through the American prison system. By the 1990s, inmates who had grown up in Appalachia were teaching other prisoners the philosophy of legal self-defense, how to condition your body, how to understand leverage, how to position yourself, how to use environmental objects in ways that couldn't be proven to be intentional. The remarkable thing was that this knowledge thrived in an environment where actual weapons were rare and heavily guarded. Inmates learned to think like their Appalachian grandfathers. They learned to see the world as a landscape of possibilities. A prison yard became not a place of helplessness, but a place where conditioning, positioning, and understanding could provide the only kind of defense available to them. This circulation of knowledge through American prisons became a secondary transmission mechanism. Inmates released from federal facilities carried this philosophy back to their home communities. Men who had learnt in prison about body conditioning and leverage went back to the mountains and became, in their own way, teachers of the same tradition. By the early 2000s, the federal government had essentially given up trying to define and prosecute these grey area weapons. The legal system had become too cluttered with cases that couldn't be won. A man carrying a roll of pennies could claim he needed exact change. A man wearing a heavy belt could claim he needed the structural support. A man who was exceptionally strong and well-trained could claim that his body was simply the result of years of honest work. The law had been checkmated by understanding that existed in a realm beyond written statute. The legislators had tried to prohibit objects. The mountain culture had responded by learning to see objects differently. The government tried to define weapons. The Appalachian tradition had created something that looked like ordinary life and nothing but ordinary life. This represents one of the most significant and least recognized developments in American self-defense culture. Not the invention of new weapons, but the complete philosophical reorientation of how ordinary people could remain capable in a world that tried to legislate that capability out of existence. Today, looking back from the vantage point of the 21st century, we can see this entire arc clearly. The evolution from actual prohibited weapons in the 1930s and 1940s to the gradual prohibition of those objects, to the cultural shift that made mountain communities think about defense in entirely different ways, to the final state where a man could be completely harmless looking and completely capable at the same time. The objects themselves became almost irrelevant. What mattered was the understanding that lived inside a person's mind, the knowledge that position mattered, that angles mattered, that distance mattered, that timing mattered, that understanding how another human being would react mattered more than understanding how a particular piece of steel would behave. This was the secret that couldn't be legislated away. This was the understanding that made your grandfather dangerous not because of what he carried, but because of what he knew. And the most extraordinary thing about this knowledge was that it was never truly secret at all. It was hiding in plain sight, embedded in the ordinary rhythms of ordinary life, passed on in the spaces between words, demonstrated in the way a man stood in a doorway, or adjusted his weight on his feet, or held a tool in his hand. Every grandfather understood something that modern self-defense instructors spend thousands of dollars trying to teach. The real weapon was never the object. It was the mind that wielded it. It was the understanding that survival came not from what you carried, but from how you thought about the world around you. A man walking a dark Hollows trail at midnight was already armed with something more powerful than any blade or bludgeon. He was armed with awareness. He knew which shadows could hide a man. He knew which sounds meant danger and which meant nothing. He knew how to read the landscape like a book written in tree branches and stone, and he could move through it without announcing his presence to every predator within earshot. That knowledge alone kept him alive more often than any concealed object in his pocket ever could. But here is what the government feared most about that generation. It wasn't that they carried forbidden weapons. It was that they understood how to improvise them. A man who had spent his life working with tools, with materials, with his hands, understood something that regulation could never touch. He understood that the world around him was full of objects that could be repurposed, that could become instruments of self-preservation if circumstances demanded it. A shovel was a shovel until it wasn't. A piece of rope was cordage until it was a restraint. A piece of wood was lumber until it was a club. This wasn't about owning prohibited items. This was about owning a mindset that authority could never fully criminalize. And the reason your grandfather seemed invulnerable wasn't because he had studied some ancient martial system or trained with some legendary instructor. It was because his entire life had been a training ground. Every day spent in a coal mine taught him about leverage and force. Every day spent splitting wood taught him about timing and rhythm. Every day spent working with unforgiving materials taught him that hesitation led to injury and that commitment meant survival. His education wasn't in a dojo, it was in the mountains themselves. The final secret that shaped your grandfather's generation was something that modern society has largely abandoned. It was the understanding that conflict resolution often required the credible capability of violence, not the desire for violence, not the love of violence, but the quiet, understated ability to end a situation if every other option had been exhausted. When a man walked into a saloon or a general store or a labor meeting, and everyone in that room knew that he was capable of defending himself, fewer people tried to take advantage of him. The strongest man in the room is almost always the one who least needs to prove it. Your grandfather never needed to throw most of the punches that lesser men might have thrown because his reputation preceded him. And that reputation wasn't built on boasting or aggression. It was built on consistent, calm competence. It was built on the knowledge that he could handle himself, and everyone around him sensed it. This is perhaps the most illegal thing of all in modern society. Not the weapons themselves, but the confidence that came from knowing how to use them. Which brings us to the final truth that nobody wants to speak out loud. The weapons we've discussed throughout this journey, the blackjacks and the saps, the brass knuckles and the weighted implements, these were never really the primary reason that generation maintained order in communities where law enforcement was hours away. The weapons mattered, yes, but they mattered because they represented something deeper. They represented a willingness to take responsibility for your own survival. They represented a culture where every person was expected to be capable of protecting themselves and their families without waiting for government authorization or official permission. That is the knowledge that made your grandfather truly dangerous. Not the items he carried, not the techniques he knew, but the mindset he carried from childhood onward. The understanding that his safety was his responsibility, that his family's security depended on his capability, that the world rewarded preparedness and punished complacency. And if you want to understand this world more deeply, if you want to know the specific histories of these forbidden items and how they were used, I've put together a comprehensive resource that goes far beyond what we can cover in a single video. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It explores not just the weapons themselves, but the culture that created them, the men who carried them, and the reasons why they were ultimately forbidden. What we've uncovered today is the edge of a much larger history, a history of self-reliance and resourcefulness that shaped the American frontier, a history of regular men who faced extraordinary circumstances and who understood that waiting for help was often the same as waiting to die. Your grandfather didn't invent these weapons. He inherited a tradition that went back centuries, a tradition of making do with what you had, a tradition of understanding that survival favors the prepared and the aware. The items we've discussed are now illegal. The culture that produced them has largely faded, The men who carried these things with casual confidence are mostly gone, but the knowledge they possessed, the understanding of leverage, timing, awareness, and responsibility that cannot be legislated away, that lives on in family stories and in the genetic memory of what it means to be truly self-sufficient. If you want to go deeper into this material, if you want to understand the specific regulations that made each of these items illegal, the court cases that shaped their prohibition, and the documented histories of how they were actually used in frontier justice and mining wars, everything is waiting for you in the channel description and in that pinned comment at the top of the section. This is too much knowledge to leave unexplored. The final thing to understand is this. Your grandfather lived in a time when the government was just beginning to realize that they couldn't control an armed and educated population. So they started with the weapons. They regulated the blackjacks and the brass knuckles and the saps. They made the roll of pennies illegal in certain jurisdictions. They established age limits on everything that could be turned into a weapon. But every regulation revealed something important. It revealed what the authorities feared most. And what they feared most wasn't the objects themselves. It was the type of man who could assess a situation, identify the resources available to him, and make a quick decision about what needed to happen next. That type of man is harder to regulate than any weapon, because that type of man will use whatever comes to hand: a walking stick, a piece of furniture, the ground itself. The laws that forbade specific items were ultimately an admission of something that the authorities could never quite articulate. They were an admission that they couldn't control the human mind. They couldn't legislate away generations of accumulated knowledge about how the world actually works. Your grandfather understood this. He knew that carrying the forbidden items was increasingly risky. He knew that the world was changing, but he also knew that the core knowledge, the understanding of how to move, how to read a situation, how to remain calm under pressure, how to assess resources and make decisions quickly, none of that could be taken away from him. That lived in his body, it lived in his reflexes, it lived in the way he thought about the world. So as we end this exploration of the weapons that shaped frontier America, remember this. The real story isn't about the objects, it's about the people who carried them. It's about a generation of men who understood that taking care of themselves and their families was a responsibility they couldn't delegate to anyone else. It's about a culture of self-reliance that has almost entirely disappeared from modern society. And it's about understanding that every regulation, every law, every restriction on what people can carry is ultimately an attempt to control something that has always been fundamentally uncontrollable: the human drive to survive. Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring the weapons that the history books tried to bury and the men who carried them without apology. If you found this journey through forgotten American history as fascinating as I do, please hit that subscribe button and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next chapter of these hidden stories. Like this